Hello, everybody. Welcome to the GAP update. I'm just going to give it about 2 minutes to make sure everyone can get on. We have a few others on the line, including Fleur Newman from the UNFCCC Secretariat, Lisa Goeldner from Gender CC, who's going to be sharing some inputs from the Women and Gender Constituency, Verona Collantes from UN Women, and then Verania Chao from UNDP, who will be sharing some inputs on how they have been using and looking at the Gender Action Plan in relation to their work. So as I said, we'll start in just 2 minutes. If you have any questions, you can put it into the questions box. Particularly if you're having any trouble seeing or hearing, do let us know. And just as a check, you should be seeing my screen at the moment. So if you're having any trouble seeing the screen, please let me know. Okay. So I'm just going to unmute Fleur for a second. Fleur, just to double check, when I started the broadcast, you can still see my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. If you don't mind, because there's no feedback at the moment, I'm going to leave you unmuted so that way I have someone to jump in if the computer goes weird or if we lose technology. So you're unmuted at the moment, Fleur. Is that okay?
That's fine. I'll actually mute myself from this end.
Okay.
So that I can jump in, yeah.
You can jump in, great. Okay, so we will just get started. We have a good group of attendees on, and we are recording this, so hopefully people can come back to it at the end and review any of the pieces that we share today. I'm going to just change this view to full screen mode, and hopefully that has not stopped you being able to see it. Oops. There we go. Okay, so we actually did a brief update around the Gender Action Plan at the CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women here in New York last week. I am Bridget Burns, the co-director of the Women's Environment and Development Organization. I think many of you know we do, but this is just a brief slide reminding you some of the work that we do and the goals that we have as a global women's advocacy organization. And one thing that we don't really have time to do because we don't want to take up too much of your time today on the webinar, and we also want to give an opportunity for questions and other inputs on what work and how you're thinking about the Gender Action Plan. I'm not going to go too much into the timeline as to how we arrived at the Gender Action Plan, although I will say that it has been years, probably almost a decade or more, that women's rights organizations and gender advocates have been engaged in the UNFCCC process and the UN climate process, and really over the course of the last decade have seen significant shifts through dedicated advocacy, very strategic influence, and really creating those normative shifts into how gender equality is recognized within the context of climate change. I'll say that it certainly, when at least I started working in the UN climate process over 8 or 9 years ago, it was quite difficult and very siloed to talk about gender issues. And now I would say that the recognition is there across the board. Of course, there's a ton of work to do when you go deeper into the understanding of gender issues among decision makers and delegates, and also the understanding of how it works in implementation. But to have the Gender Action Plan one of the top priorities as an outcome of COP23, a political outcome, and having really strong political will across all of the different negotiating groups in the different regions is a good example of how much this intersection has shifted in recognition. And it has also worked, I think, and civil society has worked in particular to make sure that gender equality is linked with other issues around human rights, including rights of Indigenous peoples, and that rights package, if you will, is something that I feel is having a stronger presence in the entirety of the UNFCCC process. But gender, I think, has a specific timeline to where the Gender Action Plan came from. And I listed here this pocket guide that We Do worked with ECBI to create that actually will give you the full history if you're interested. And we'll go through each of the key technical, textual inputs that that we achieved as parties and observers that were adopted in relation to key mandates around finance, adaptation, technology, etc. And one, I think, important thing to know about the Gender Action Plan, if you're not completely familiar with it, is that the purpose of it is not to create the new mandates or to create new mandates for parties in relation to implementation or even for the Secretariat necessarily, but I think the overall goal was to look at what mandates already existed in relation, as I said before, to kind of finance, technology, and put in place actions that would actually help all of us to see and realize and achieve the intention behind those mandates. So that was a lot of the approach to the Gender Action Plan. So I think it probably looks different than maybe other gender action plans that you might know or have seen, and that's some of the background to it. And others can give input into that as well for some feedback. So the priority areas of the Gender Action Plan are related to capacity building, knowledge sharing and communications, gender balance, participation in women's leadership, coherence, and here I think broadly speaking, a lot of it focuses on coherence among the different bodies of the UNFCCC, the Secretariat and parties, and really coherence in the implementation because there are different mandates. And just to, when I say mandates, there's basically decisions that include language on gender, whether it's gender balance or gender analysis across the different somewhat thematic areas of the climate negotiations. But there is also coherence with other processes that at least in the creation of the Gender Action Plan, individuals and groups engaged in it were thinking about coherence with other processes like the SDG process, for example. Gender responsive implementation and the means of implementation. So this is where it looks at NDCs and finance and what activities could further enhance that. And then there's a section on monitoring and reporting. And so I'm just going to, as quickly as I can, go through the actual plan itself. If you look, the plan has a decision. It has, and then the Gender Action Plan is annexed to that decision, and it includes a chapeau that goes further into details about these priority areas, and also further elaborates the intention of the Gender Action Plan. So in that first piece, if you remember around capacity building, there are two activities, one of which is hosting workshops, providing technical assistance, etc., to enhance the capacity of parties and stakeholders to develop gender-responsive policies, plans, and programs across all areas. And the second is in relation to a submission, where this is really the start of a collection of information of what has been and what continues to be this systemic integration of gender-sensitive and participatory education, training, etc. So that deadline is actually coming up on March 30th. I'll let Fleur speak to that a little bit, as well as Lisa, because this is related to the guidance document that's been created. The second piece, which is around gender balance, and again, we have decisions, both standalone decisions and mandates across many of the constituted bodies of the negotiations that talks about the importance of enhancing gender balance. And this is really aims to be a set of activities to enhance that implementation. One is to promote travel funds, and I think in a unique piece of this is that it also includes not only the participation of women in national delegations, but specifies including those from grassroots, local, and Indigenous peoples communities from developing countries, LDCs, and SIDS. So I think this is unique for the Gender Action Plan and something certainly from an advocacy and an implementation perspective, is really useful to think about, and how we create activities to support that. A second is including regular notifications to parties at the time of the nominations to UNFCCC bodies on the gender composition. I'll let Fleur speak to that. A third is to organize and conduct capacity building training on leadership, negotiation, facilitation, and chairing in the context of the UNFCCC process. And then the fourth is to cooperate in, promote, facilitate, and develop both formal and non-formal education and training programs targeting women and youth in particular on climate change at all levels. In the third area, which is around, C, which is around the implementation piece, coherence, there is a request for a dialogue at SBI 48, which is the upcoming SBI, open to both parties and observers with the chairs of the UNFCCC constituted bodies. And again, part of this is how to create some coherence in the implementation, where you have some technical bodies that might be doing a lot on gender and others that maybe are not doing so much. And I'll let Fleur speak to that. The second is to provide capacity building to chairs and members of the UNFCCC bodies and technical teams on how to integrate gender considerations. And I think that, again, this is both something that will be done internally, and Fleur can speak to how that is done, but also this is an invitation to others to consider how that capacity building is done. And then the third is to share information on efforts made to support the implementation of activities and enhancing synergies with other UN processes like the 2030 Agenda. In the implementation, the means of implementation piece, there's 3 activities. One is around a meeting, a dialogue by the Standing Committee on Finance. So invites this committee, the SCF, to host a dialogue specifically looking at the commitments that already exist on integrating gender considerations, particularly emphasizing the relevance of gender-responsive access to finance in implementation. There is another piece on cooperating with the CTCN and sharing information about that, which is due towards the end of November, and I'll let Fleur speak to that. And then the third is strengthen capacity of gender mechanisms, including for parliamentarians, the IPU commissions for the integration of gender responsive budgeting, etc. And then in the last piece, on monitoring and reporting, there is a call for submissions, again, which is due at the end of March. There is a request to prepare a synthesis report on that submission, and that's something that will be done by the Secretariat. There is a request for an update report on how the CTCN, the Climate Technology Center Network, is working in conjunction with the Technology Executive Committee, is contributing to the aim of accelerating development and transfer of technology, including taking into account gender considerations. And then finally, to encourage knowledge exchange activities among the Secretariat staff across all thematic areas. So what does all of that mean? And I should say that in the actual action plan itself, it also includes who is responsible for these, and if there is a specific timeline, to what timeline it is. A couple things on the action plan itself: it will be reviewed at the end of next year. And maybe, Fleur, you can speak a bit to what that process might look like. But there is this timeline to which activities are expected to be undertaken. And in the parties responsible, as you see, there are a few that are very specific to the Secretariat, but for the majority of these activities, it's very much open to all parties and all observers to consider how to contribute to this action plan. Sorry, I just realized my screen sharing went off. I'm just gonna put it back. How to contribute to these activities. And so one of the things that we emphasized last week, and that we've been talking about, for example, as the Women and Gender Constituency, is that the effectiveness and the impact of this action plan really relies on how much both observers, parties, put into actually achieving the activities laid out here and contributing to that. And so we're hoping that we can all work in a very coordinated and systematic way to share this information, to make sure information flow is happening to the Secretariat, and to give each other an opportunity to share inputs on how, as different organizations and entities, we are trying to input into the Gender Action Plan. So a couple of the advocacy strategies that we have for the GAP implementation is, first of all, creating some sort of framing or guidance note for both parties and observers on these upcoming submissions. And it's not just to get parties to give information, but also those groups who may not consider gender their issue or may not be looking at it and following it in the process of the negotiations. And I'll pass over to Lisa just after this to give an update on that. Thinking about how we, whether it's a template or just by sharing this information, emphasizing and requesting parties and observers to develop their own gap assessments or strategy notes, so how they will be implementing it or how it relates to their own work. And this is partly what Verania and Verona will give inputs to in terms of how their agencies are looking at it. One example is that we've been conducting early advocacy on the upcoming dialogues, like the Standing Committee on Finance, to make sure that when that opportunity comes up, that there's new research and information to actually feed into that dialogue. And then we've been talking about the best way to create, even though there'll be an official, some sort of process of review within the GAP itself, how civil society can track and monitor progress on what has been done, what inputs have been given, and where we really see that work happening at the end of the Gender Action Plan. And just as a quick example, if we do, as an organization, was looking at the Gender Action Plan itself, looking at the activities, and then putting in our own actions that relate to those activities. So in relation to capacity building, which is on any form of capacity, developing capacity and workshops related to the intersection of gender and climate change. We do that a lot, but I just put an example here that we'll be delivering a workshop on gender responsive climate finance at COP24. In the activities around gender balance, one of those is to promote travel funds. We, of course, implement the Women Delegates Fund, which is a travel fund, and we'll continue to do that, but also are trying to consider a strategic assessment of that fund to work towards the actual advocacy to how they work and how we could create more of those resources across the board. Non-formal training is also part of that. So I had put an example here that we are hosting events at CSW that particularly target women and youth around issues of environment and climate change. And then finally, in means of implementation, we're actually talking, for example, with some groups in the Caribbean about a training with parliamentarians. So this is a really quick assessment, but it's something that we think other observers and other parties could be doing and should be doing for themselves to see how the actions and activities they have actually line up with the objectives of the action plan. So with that, I'm actually going to just double check and see if we have questions, and if not, which we don't, I'm going to unmute Lisa and pass over to you just to explain the guidance note, and I'm going to pull it up as well. So I just unmuted you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you very much, Bridget. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa. I'm working with Gender CC Women for Climate Justice. And yeah, so Bridget has been introducing the Gender Action Plan, and there is actually two opportunities coming up how we can contribute to the Gender Action Plan. And those are the two submissions that Bridget has already mentioned. And in order to help parties, but also observers to prepare those two submissions on gender and climate change, the Women and Gender Constituency has put together a guidance note that contains a couple of key questions to help parties and also observers to prepare those submissions. So you're all seeing this guidance note there on your screens at the moment, and I will quickly guide you through what these submissions encompass and then present some of those guiding questions that we have prepared. So the first submission under the Gender Action Plan is actually what is Activity 1 in this priority area E on monitoring and reporting. And it consists of 3 parts, which should, when you submit something where applicable, have sex disaggregated data, and gender analysis. So those 3 parts, the first one is information on the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and men. The second one is on the integration of gender considerations into any climate-related policies, plans, and actions. And the third one is on policies and plans for and also progress made on enhancing gender balance in the national climate delegations of parties. So on those 3 parts of the submissions, we have developed these guiding questions. And the idea is really also to make it easier for countries to identify what kind of information is actually interesting to include when they prepare these submissions. And of course, to support them in doing that at all. So as I said, this first part is on the differentiated impacts of climate change on women and men. And there you see that on your screens, the questions that we have prepared. So the first question that we ask is really, are there any surveys, are there any studies available on the impacts of climate change in the countries that include sex disaggregated data? Is there any data available on the impacts on local communities and indigenous peoples? Are there any guidelines, recommendations in place how this sex disaggregated data should be collected? And then the following questions are more towards hinting towards what links are between the impacts of climate change and gender roles and norms in society. So we ask, for example, if there's any information available how the impacts of climate change affect disproportionately people that have unpaid or paid care tasks in families and communities. If there's any information with regards to natural disasters on the victims of these natural disasters, if there's any sex disaggregated data available there, if there's sex disaggregated data available on the increase of incidents of physical and sexual violence. We ask if there's any information on gender differences in climate-induced displacement and migration, if there's any information on on the impacts of climate change on women and men with regards to health, with regards to education, access to water and sanitation, food security. So as you see, these questions were developed to make those people that prepare the submissions aware of where those links are, which issue areas could be interesting. And then moving on to the second part of the submission, which asks about the integration of gender considerations into climate-related policies, plans, and actions. So there, of course, the obvious first question is, are there any policies in place on gender equality and climate change in the specific countries? And there are a couple of countries that have climate change gender action plans. So this would really be a good opportunity to show best practices on the integration of gender in national policies, plans, strategies, actions. We furthermore ask if, which I found is quite important when it comes to the integration of gender aspects into these plans and policies, is the institutional framework also in place. So we ask if there's any sort of interministerial exchange on the issue of gender and climate change, if the governmental body in charge of women and gender equality issues is involved in the planning and implementing of climate action. We, of course, ask if gender experts are consulted when planning and implementing climate action, if civil society organizations, foremost women and gender organizations, local communities and indigenous peoples are consulted. And then moving on to the third part, which is about policies and plans to enhance gender balance in the national climate delegations. There are the 3 guiding questions that we developed. The first one is, do countries monitor and evaluate the gender composition of their climate delegation? Are there any guidelines in place? Is there a quota for women? And then the third one is on capacity training. What kind of good practices exist to enhance the capacity for women's equal participation in the national delegations? So as you see, I think for this first submission, it's very, very useful to collect everything that's available as information, everything that's available as tools and methodologies that can aid to integrate gender meaningfully into any type of national and local level climate action. And then about that second submission, before I move on to that. So Bridget has mentioned that all these submissions that will be made, they will be compiled in a synthesis report, and they also form the basis for the in-session workshop that's coming up at the ESB sessions in Bonn. So you can also include any recommendations that you have for that workshop. So now I'm moving on to that second submission that is also due at the end of March, which is on the systematic integration of gender-sensitive and participatory education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information from national to local level, again, into all climate-related activities, including the implementation of NDCs and formulation of long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies. So this again, this information will be the basis for a dialogue that will be held under the Action for Climate Empowerment agenda of the SBI. So for this submission, we've also developed a couple of guiding questions. And for example, here we ask particularly about the NDCs, but also about any other national climate activities implemented under the Convention and the Paris Agreement, if those people involved in the planning process, if they had formal trainings on gender-sensitive approaches, if there was an equitable participation of women and men in this planning process, if key stakeholders, especially from local communities and indigenous peoples, were consulted, if women's organizations were included in this process, if gender experts had the possibility to give input with their expertise. We also asked if there was sufficient access to data and information relevant to participate meaningfully in public consultations when developing the NDCs, when developing climate activities. And finally, we ask what are the capacity needs, like if it's found difficult by parties and organizations to identify the gender aspects and the specific needs and options and priorities to effectively promote participatory and gender-sensitive approaches, then we ask, so what is the capacity need? What is needed to enhance gender-sensitive and participatory approaches in this respect? And yeah, I just want to close my short input with really encouraging all of you to make a submission to this. I think this is really a window of opportunity under the Gender Action Plan now to also show how much is already available. So besides of parties, I also really want to encourage civil society and also especially researchers to give input to this issue. I think a lot of research has been done, a lot of methodologies and tools have been already developed, and this would really be the time to compile that in a submission and to feed it into this process and the joint learning process that the Gender Action Plan enables. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm going to just pass right over then to Fleur to add on and give some more information on all those things that I kept saying. I'll leave to Fleur.
Thank you. I did take a note of that. Of all of those things. And I would just to point out that although we have a deadline for the 30th of March for the first submissions on the differentiated impacts, the three topics, the synthesis report will not be prepared until next year, and so that call for submissions will actually be open well into this time next year. So this won't be the only opportunity, but one of the reasons why we put the 30th is because we would like some inputs in preparation for the workshop. But I'll come back to that because I'll start at the beginning. So the first submission that is in the Gender Action Plan is actually around action for climate empowerment, and that submission, the reason it has also a 30 March due date is because it will be the subject of, or it will be incorporated into the 6th dialogue, which will be held at SBI 48. And that is, the 6th dialogue is actually looking at, normally each year they do one on education and training and the other on all of the public information, access to information and public awareness. So that this year it's around public participation and awareness, and it will have a focus on gender. So the submissions will be helpful for that purpose. But if you also have examples in relation to education and training, that would be useful as well, because we'll look to do have a gender focus in the ACE dialogue next year as well. The B2, which is on notifications, so we already notify or let the parties know when we send out a reminder that there are elections coming up for the nominations for constituted bodies. We already point out that there is a goal on gender balance, but we will now be including in the notification the latest data on the gender composition of each of the constituted bodies when we send out that notification. And we're looking for other ways in which we can also communicate it besides the letter that we send out, so that it's those who need to see it, see it. Then on the dialogue with the chairs of the constituted bodies, this is sort of part of a package of things. One is that in the decision in Marrakesh, which extended the Lima work program, there was a request by the COP to all constituted bodies to include in their regular reports information on the integration of gender considerations in their respective areas of work. And in support of that request, the Secretariat was requested to develop a technical paper, which we will have ready for SBI 48, and the dialogue, which will be held at SBI 48 with the chairs of the constituted bodies or their representatives, is intended to then review the technical paper and to identify good practices, but also challenges to reporting as requested. Then there is under coherence on the internal training, or on the training of the chairs and members of constituted bodies, as well as the technical teams. That is something which has been tasked not only to the Secretariat but others, and we will look to work with observer organisations to also provide that support. Then with the CTCN and Gender Day and means of gender responsive implementation and means of implementation, the CTCN, are we working with CTCN to highlight what is going on with the CTCN and gender, and we will do that on Gender Day, and we'll look to also provide opportunities to sort of broader opportunity around technology on Gender Day. Then in area E1, which is on monitoring and reporting, that the submission, as I said, is supporting the workshop, but also the synthesis report. So if you are not able to get your information in by the 30th of March, that's okay. We will continue to accept that into 2019, and in fact would encourage you to provide us with updates. You can certainly submit more than once, and if you have a project which is happening later in the year that you want to inform us about, we would encourage you to do that on an ongoing basis. And then lastly, on the review process, there's also a request in the decision, in Decision 3 CP23, which is the decision on the Gender Action Plan. There's a request for the Secretariat to prepare for consideration at COP25 a synthesis report on the progress of implementation of the Gender Action Plan, identifying areas of progress, areas for improvement, and further work to be undertaken. And this is where it's very important for information to be provided to the Secretariat. We don't actually have a formal means by which to do that at the moment, but we will look to see how we might open up an open call, perhaps, on providing that information to the Secretariat so that we can see and so that parties can see through the synthesis report all of the activities that are in fact taken in support of the Gender Action Plan. And this is what Bridget and Lisa were both speaking of in relation to the analysis and what each organisation is doing. And I will leave it there, but I'm obviously happy to take questions.
Thank you, Fleur. Can I just ask you, before I forget, do you happen to know yet the potential dates of the workshop?
This is really, yes, we are looking at the possibility of ideally we will have the workshop across a day and a half, with the first day in the first week and the second part in the second week, and the dialogue at this stage, it looks like it will be in the second week. There are a lot of mandated events during this particular session, and so it's a bit of a moving feast at the moment, and that won't be confirmed for a few more weeks, but that's the aim at the moment.
Sorry, you said that there'd be a first day potentially in the first week, so it might be split across the 2 weeks?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and the ACE dialogue is likely to be in the second week as well.
Excellent. Perfect. So I'm going to pass now over to, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to pass over to Verania, and I'm going to be pulling up your slide as well. Oh, you're self-muted, so you can work on unmuting yourself, Verania. Excellent. I see. Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you, Bridget.
Okay. There you go. So I'm just showing your slide now. Oh, that's, I think, the wrong one. Sorry.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you, Bridget. Good morning, everyone. I will share with you information in terms of how UNDP is supporting countries in meeting their national climate targets through different capacity building platforms at the national, regional, and global levels. But for the sake of time, I will focus on the work at the national level. So UNDP is supporting countries mainly through the NDC support program, which is a nationally determined contributions support program, which will support the UNFCCC Gender Action Plan by providing a platform for countries to translate their gender responsive goals into inclusive and integrated actions. We think that it's important that gender and climate efforts are factored in as a combination into climate change policies at the national level. And we see the GAP as a useful tool for countries to guide them on key aspects and gender considerations within their climate change policies and plans. But we also think that it's important that countries link clearly their national work and efforts to the GAP. So we are aiming to support these to happen through the NDC support program and provide in that sense a clarity on concrete actions to take within 3 key areas: governance, planning, and policy instruments. So overall, the program will create the building blocks and lead to tangible outputs and results that we help meet the GAP's objectives as well, and provide and share concrete examples and lessons learned. So if you can then, Bridget, move to the first slide, please. Okay. So we are currently working with 10 countries that are part of this NDC support program. And we consider the need of developing or conducting an in-depth gender analysis. And in the slide that you are seeing now, you will see how we have identified and mapped the relation between the gap with our global project expected results, and kind of like an explanation of how or why do we think that you know, this process at the national level will support the gap and at the same time benefit from ensuring these two tools are well connected. So the pre-scoping exercise of conducting an in-depth gender analysis, we think is crucial because policies often simplify gender relations and the different needs, concerns of women without really addressing sector-specific gender inequalities. So we are suggesting and supporting countries to focus on their key climate change sectors and perform these in-depth analyses. The information that will be gathered through these analyses, it's critical to better understand women's roles, the capacities and the potential in these priority sectors, and will inform the approaches taken for these other areas that I have mentioned on governance, planning, and policy. If you then move to the second one, please. So as I said, can you then, yeah, thank you. So, as I said, one of these areas is governance, which is about institutional frameworks and coordination mechanisms. So you will see that on the left side of the table, you know, we have indicated the aspects that the Gender Action Plan is considering in terms of governance, and then, as I mentioned, you know, how we see this program, you know, can be linked and support the work at the national level and as well at the global level. So so we think that climate strategies need to incorporate women's knowledge and views, but women are often absent from these decision-making processes. And women's participation in leadership, decision-making, and community representation are central to delivering a successful climate action. So we are hoping that this program then will assist countries in strengthening their institutional capacities to mainstream gender, on the one hand, by ensuring that ministries, for instance, of women's or gender equality participate in the planning and the decision-making process, but also women's organizations that are closer to the reality of communities and local populations. So we are ensuring that both actors are well engaged in these processes. If you can then move to the second one or the third slide, please. Bridget, thank you. So then in terms of the planning, this is about the NDC plans and sectorial maps. So countries have decided, you know, whether they want to have a national NDC plan that will guide their process, or in some cases they have decided to develop sectorial roadmaps for each of these key climate sectors. So we think it's crucial to mainstream gender into these climate change policies and programs, which will help ensuring women's needs and contributions are considered across the planning and the execution cycle of these policies and projects and programs, including the monitoring and the transparency systems. And this is where we are also linking with other regional platforms that are already supporting countries in strengthening their capacities to integrate gender into their monitoring and reporting tools or instruments. So countries will prioritize sectors to examine gender considerations and undertake the assessments to improve this planning process. And they will also focus on developing gender indicators and data systems to track and to report on their gender responsive climate actions, particularly looking at mitigation, but we will also link with other programs and work that is happening at the country level on adaptation. So then looking into the third area of policy, which is about enhancing these mitigation and adaptation instruments. And we think it's really key for countries to include gender considerations within these specific instruments, and to ensure that, as I was saying, women's capacity, it's actually taken into account as a way of changing this view between, the vulnerabilities and the agency that can women bring to the decision-making process and taking the lead in this regard. And we think also it's relevant to try to be as concrete as possible to also link these actions to other relevant plans that are linked to broader development aspects within the SDGs. So these are two processes that countries are being discussing in terms of how to ensure that their climate change targets are well integrated and even embedded in their development plans. And finally, if you go to the last slide, this work and the program that we are supporting includes a global component. We think that it's crucial to keep ensuring these spaces and the knowledge sharing at different levels, the regional, the global, and the national level, and to disseminate the information at different levels as well, and ensure that other processes, platforms, programs, can replicate and learn from this experience to multiply the impacts. And I think this is something that has been discussed over and over through the past weeks in the CSW, for instance, in those events that have talked on climate and gender equality and women's empowerment. We have heard from different actors saying, the need of keep sharing and this knowledge and ensuring that it's available to all. So thank you very much. This is what I wanted to share with you today, and I will be here for any questions that might come from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Verania. Before I actually move on, I wanted to ask the question myself for those who are on the call. Could you just share the countries that you're working in, and then if there are groups or organizations or even activists in those countries who may not already be engaged in the national processes that are being undertaken related to the NDCs, do you have any advice for who they might approach or how they might start getting in touch to be engaged in those processes?
Yeah, so let me first mention the 10 countries. So we are working in Africa, in Uganda, Zambia, Ghana, and Kenya. In Latin America, it's Chile, Colombia, and Ecuador. In the Arab states, it's Lebanon. And in the And in Asia Pacific, it's the Philippines and Bhutan. And I think the best focal point to contact will be UNDP country office, because we are, working with our country offices and ensuring that these processes are, like nationally led. So I think that the best contact will be the country offices, and from there, then we can also identify other units or departments within the ministries and within our project coordinators as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Super helpful. So, Verona, I'm just going to now quickly pass over to you to get some inputs on, and I've just unmuted you, on UN Women and how you've already been thinking about the Gender Action Plan in your work.
Okay, thank you, Bridget, and thank you for organizing this webinar. Just to say that UN Women, and including the top management of UN Women, is really very excited that the UNFCCC process has this gender action plan, and as you know, we have been engaged in this process since 8 years ago, in my case, and which is more or less when UN Women started as UN Women. So I really have a personal, also a personal journey in seeing this the gap finally adopted. So for just a brief background on UN Women's engagement in the climate change process, we are contributing to this in the global, regional, and country levels through the negotiations and in seeing that outcomes of the UNFCCC process integrate gender equality, women's human rights, and women's participation. And also developing the capacity of delegates and other partners to mainstream gender equality considerations into climate change policies and programs. And third, supporting multi-stakeholder efforts to leverage development co-benefits between gender equality and climate action. So in the past, we worked by not just I mentioned already the intergovernmental process, that's very important, but we also worked to develop knowledge products, for example, through our research work, one example of which is the work on ensuring a comprehensive approach to achieve the goal of gender balance in the UNFCCC process, which have been revised and became the basis also of the UNFCCC or fed into the UNFCCC work on promoting gender balance. UN Women also provides training and capacity building, as I mentioned. I'll just give a few examples. Through the request of the Green Climate Fund, UNFCCC UN Women trained over 50 national designated authorities and focal points. That was in 2016. And with that, guidebook was published on leveraging co-benefits between gender equality and climate action for sustainable development and mainstreaming gender in Green Climate Fund projects. UN Women also has extensive experience in gender responsive budgeting, as some of you may know, and later on I will discuss where that would be beneficial in implementing the gap. And finally, in addressing the nexus of gender equality and climate change, UN Women has 3 flagship programming initiatives. One, Women's Entrepreneurship for Sustainable Energy. The second one is Women's Empowerment through Climate Smart Agriculture. And third, the flagship program on addressing the gender inequality of risk and promoting community resilience to natural hazards in a changing climate. So all of these are aligned with a number of SDGs, targets, and indicators. Now, going to UN Women's proposed contribution to the implementation of the UNFCCC GAP, I'll go through it according to priority areas, and I'm conscious of the time, so I can expand in the questions later on. But so on the submissions, thank you for the guidelines in the earlier presentation. We will definitely, we're working on this already, and we are doing some research ourselves and also looking at our own work on how to make how to make a meaningful submission that will inform not just the synthesis report but also the dialogue. On the capacity building, B3, capacity building training on leadership, negotiation, facilitation, chairing, and also the other capacity building activities. Fleur mentioned earlier that they're also looking, the UNFCCC Secretariat is also looking at how they can partner with observer organizations, and we've had an initial discussion on this, and we would be happy to engage in this, including also on a possible training of gender focal points in delegations to the UNFCCC. So the specifics will be worked out, but we're ready to support that. On the on sharing information on efforts made to support the implementation of activities to enhance synergies. This is, I'm looking at C3. We will be happy to engage at COP24 with partners on this one. And hopefully by that time, we will have enough to say about what we have done. We're also thinking of contributing to D3, strengthening the capacity of gender mechanisms, including for parliamentarians. This is in the context of our work on gender responsive budgeting training course, which could include virtual and in-person training, applying GRB to climate financing, addressing both adaptation and mitigation efforts, emphasizing how GRB analysis need to explore interlinkages or challenges between climate change-related expenditures and fiscal policy and gender objectives. So we also, on climate change and gender inequality of risk, we're also looking at developing standardized regional guidelines and tools for gender-responsive budgeting for climate change adaptation and DRR, including preparedness and recovery, and providing technical support to national governments, particularly national disaster management organizations. My timer is ringing, so let me just quickly wrap this up. Again, there was E4, which particularly specified UN Women, encouraging knowledge exchange activities among the Secretariat staff across all thematic areas. We've done this with the UNFCCC Secretariat, and again, depending on the need and the request, we would be happy to support that as well. So that's just a quick sharing of what we intend to do, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Verona, and thank you to everyone who's given input so far. I think one of the main things, main objectives that we hope to get started thinking about with this update session and with the one last week is both to help people kind of wrap their heads around both what the Gender Action Plan does and maybe doesn't do, how much is really needed from all of us in terms of advocacy and education around the GAP itself, but also what it looks like for both civil society and UN agencies and even countries, although we don't have a country on or a country panelist at the moment. We have been talking to different countries already who are thinking about the Gender Action Plan within their own kind of strategic structure as well. and how you do that, but also then how you do it, for example, in ongoing processes at national level, such as the ones that UNDP is engaged in around NDCs, and make sure you're linking back to the Gender Action Plan. And I would say that I've at least started to really look at this as an opportunity where for for many years now, there have been a ton of work that's being done at this intersection, and perhaps one thing we haven't had is this collective action plan to be monitoring, tracking, and but importantly feeding into in a way that helps us to see a broader picture of what work is being done and respond to the needs that have been put out there. So now I'm just going to see and ask if there are any questions. I see a few hands have been raised, so I'm just going to start from the bottom up in terms of actually I see that there have been some questions put out, so I'm just going to read some of them and then ask you if you would like to add to your questions that you've shared. So I see from Patricia raised that she's working in Jordan, not engaged in national processes, but would be happy to be linked to. So Patricia, I think that's great, and I agree with Verania's advice on reaching out to and linking to the UNDP focal point. Verania, if there's any specific information about who those contacts are, it would be great to use this opportunity to make those connections. The next is from May Ahmed, who is from Sudan. And May, I'm going to try to unmute you if you want to just add, because you have your hand raised as well. And it'd be great to hear how Sudan is thinking about the Gender Action Plan.
Hello?
Hi, May.
Nice to hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah. I just really, I'm very happy to hear and listen for all the presenters was there really raised. And really here in Sudan now, we are working, maybe very active, especially for assessment for identify the gender gap. And already now we have the first draft for the action plan for how really we're going to implement this gender action plan in the coming 3 months. We also is happy that we already Sudan now appointed gender focal points, and this is the first time to be happen, and it will be joining you also. We're going to do a research now. We're going to the field for 3 states in Sudan to collect really the gender role for the different climate change action and activity in the ground, and this really can help us to finalize our gender action plan. So looking for the policy aspect and also for the local community. And this also going to help us to finalize our NDCs and integrate gender also in climate policy. And our target to finalize all this activity before the end of August. And this is why maybe some of us can attend the coming meeting in May, or maybe we cannot attend because we are busy in the field. But really, I would like to have all of us one common floor to share all our outcome observation from the field, so we can learn from each other. This is one of the things I would like to ask all of the presenters.
May, can I ask you a question in terms of the Gender Action Plan that you are working on? So just to be clear, is this a process that you're doing at national level? Is it specifically related to the Gender Action Plan itself, that now you're creating an action plan to respond to that?
No, we start last year to identify a gender action plan at national level, and now we need to connect also at the state level.
Got it. So, because one of the questions that I see next from Hawa is, how do countries operationalize the Gender Action Plan, and how do we monitor the action plan at country level? So one of the things that I think you're sharing is that you had initiated this gender national action plan, and now you're working to link it to the Gender Action Plan, yes?
Yes, and also to link it with NDCs, and also climate change policy. And this is how to mainstream even gender for all the climate change actions. And this will it's not only to be gender action plan alone, but also to be mainstream with the other activity we have now in Sudan.
Okay. So thank you so much, May, and others on either those who presented or others on the call. If you have anything else in terms of the question on how it should be operationalized and tracked at national level, it would be great to add. I see a few other hands raised. Titi, I'm going to unmute you for your question or comment.
Hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear
Titi.
me now?
Yes.
Yeah, my question, I think I'm directing it to the UNDP presentation. Yeah, it's more about how have they been able to work with subnational level governments, because from the presentation they said they were working with the national level, and I know that for some countries we have some subnational level governments. For instance, in Nigeria we have the state government, we have the local government, and it will be very, very interesting, and I know that a lot of actions happen at the local level, so it's very, very important that we link what we are doing in terms of getting information and everything for the gap to see what is happening at the local level, especially when we also know that the gap talks about local communities and indigenous people. So I just want to know, as UNDP is doing its work at the national level, how have they been working with the national level platform to include subnational level governments and their activities on gender and climate issues?
Excellent. Thank you, Titi. And Zenabu, I'm going to unmute you as well. Let's see. I'm having some trouble unmuting you, Zenabu. I don't know if you're also clicking it as well. It says I've muted you, but I cannot unmute you. Zenabu, can you hear us? Okay, well, I'll try again in a minute with you, Zenabu. I'm having some trouble unmuting you. I see that there have also been some additional questions. Hannah, I'm going to unmute you. You have a question and you also have your hand raised. Yes, it worked. Go ahead. Hannah? We can't hear you, Hannah. You are unmuted, but since we can't hear you, I'm going to just ask your question aloud. So you wrote, oh, Hannah's from UN Women, and was asking a question on the guidance document on the submission, but the question is regarding monitoring and reporting of the gap, considering that the stock-taking exercise is expected to happen in less than 2 years. Will there be a monitoring structure to make sure that data is collected as part of the exercise is coherent and complements other mechanisms such as SDGs? Would the Women and Gender constituency be getting any technical support on developing and implementing a monitoring framework? So I'll actually add that to the questions. We have a question on national implementation, question on subnational, particularly for UNDP, and now this question on the monitoring. I can share some inputs on that, and then Fleur, if you want to reiterate what you said before about the review process and not necessarily having, and why the collection of information is important. Shayla, I'm going to unmute you if you would like to ask your question. Shayla?
Yes. Hi, Bridget.
Hi.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Bridget. Actually, I was going through the presentation of Gender Action Plan. So I have a particular question about the coherence of the gap. Especially, I mean that what is the extent of policy coherence amongst different climate-specific sectors like agriculture, water, land, or technology, or loss and damage areas? For example, often we found at national level there are duplication, but also there are very specific missing linkages about the implementation of GAP. I mean, not only from the climate sector, but I mean also to have interagency and interministerial coordination within the NDCs. So I'd like to have some response from the UNDP or maybe from Verona about this particular point.
Okay, so there's one question on coherence as well, with not just other processes, but the other sectors and the work that's done there. So I'm going to take one more question from Faustina. I'm going to unmute you. Faustina, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to talk on the UNDP, the in-depth analysis. The UNDP just posted for a consultant to do the in-depth analysis for integrating gender into the NDCs. And I think that the points that, what's her name? Sorry.
Verania.
Yeah, Verania talked about were very, very useful and important. And I'm wondering how we can be able to be parts of this, so that we can also help with the analysis and the integration of gender. Because when you look at the communications that they have had on the NDCs and all that, you see clearly that there's nothing on gender at all. There are so many gaps, and there's no gender at all. And they have realized that themselves, and they think that it's high time they integrated it into the NDC. So I don't know which way we will be able to contribute towards that.
Okay, so what is the process for, where are the opportunities for engagement in the analysis piece, given the really important role that UNDP plays within the NDC process?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to pass over to, I think it seems unfortunately that Fleur had to leave, but I'm going to pass over to Verona, Lisa, anyone who'd like to start. Maybe Verona, I'll unmute you first to respond, or you're self-muted, so please unmute yourself. Verania? Oh, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I was saying that thank you, Bridget, and thank you for the questions and comments. So yeah, so let me try to answer some of these questions. So regarding the question about how to better consider the subnational level in terms of the context, the work, and the stakeholders. This is one of the reasons why we, with the countries that we are working with, we have decided that performing this in-depth gender analysis was so important, because that would allow them and us to better understand all the levels and the work that is happening, and that sometimes is not necessarily well articulated, and sometimes the national level is not necessarily taking advantage of the experiences and the lessons learned developed at the local or subnational level. So we think that there is a need of identifying these specific cases, and to ensure that we are bridging this knowledge between these two levels and the actors. So I think that's an important aspect, and the way that we think we can definitely take it into account into this process, it's by identifying and looking at how to better articulate these two levels. So that's regarding the subnational. Then in terms of operationalizing the gap, like my suggestion would be that if a country or national actors are developing this gender action plan, I would suggest to coordinate as much as possible with, on the one hand, with those actors that are also working on this NDC or national process, just because it's a good entry point for revising and identifying new and relevant aspects and instruments in this regard, you know, to be included into these kind of like new or revised framework. So I think it's good to ensure that that you're able to map, you know, all the different things that, you know, are happening, and as I said, at different levels, and how these can be actually linked to this process, and then, you know, in that sense, link it to the gap, like, I mean, the UNFCCC gap. The way we think the gap can definitely support countries is in using it as a tool to guide them on key aspects, but we know it's quite broad. So each country and you know, and the national actors will have to decide, you know, what is more relevant for them. Then in terms of sector coherence, yes, I do think this is you know, this is something relevant, and that's why we are discussing with countries, and our national partners have also identified this need of focusing on concrete key climate sectors for them, to ensure that gender is like well integrated, like embedded into the different aspects and actions within those particular sectors. So I think in that sense, it's important to look at, you know, climate and gender both as two cross-cutting aspects and issues that will have to then be integrated into these key sectors. And then in terms of the consultant or this process that is happening in countries. So as I mentioned, this program has in some way just started. So countries have finalized their first stage of developing their project documents, and some of them have started implementation. Some of them will soon start implementation. And as part of this work, you know, they will have, sometimes it will be a consultant, sometimes it will be someone from the government or from other institutions that will support the implementation of this work. So that's why, you know, you have seen this advertisement of a national gender specialist, and this will be later on, you know, the key focal point to go to. For now, because in some countries, or most of them, they currently don't have this focal point as part of the team, I was suggesting that you could contact the country office, the UNDP country office, as your main contact for now. And eventually there will be one specific person following up and ensuring that, you know, the stakeholders at the national level are participating or are part of this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Verania. Verona, I'm gonna you're self-muted, so if you'd like to jump in.
Yes, I'm sorry that I have to leave at 10:30 to catch my train to go to the city. But on the question of coherence, I mentioned that, I mean, in UN Women, this is precisely what we're trying to address in our programming on gender equality and climate change. I've mentioned the approach of co-benefits, looking at it as co-benefits, and again, as UN Women, corporately, we're trying to push this idea of looking at, like Verania has mentioned, gender equality and climate action as the nexus, let's say, where you're able to leverage co-benefits. And the person who posed the question mentioned how do you interlink water, energy, and basically in our programming, I mentioned about 3 flagship programs on energy, women's entrepreneurship on energy, and then climate smart agriculture and promoting community resilience. These are all projects that leverage co-benefits. And in UN Women, when we do projects, we look at women's economic empowerment, women's political participation, we look at aspects of violence against women, and empowering them, basically, this whole idea of resilience. So I think I can give a few examples of what we have done in the past. We have in Fiji, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, this big project on, it's called Markets for Change, which was basically increasing the climate resilience of market infrastructure, which is not only disaster risk preparedness, but beyond that, really promoting livelihoods, enhancing women's economic empowerment. And I know we don't have much time, but just another example in Vietnam, where UN Women supported this Vietnam Women's Union, again, not by giving them voice in decision-making processes through capacity building, which in the end it translated into building resilience to respond to floods and natural disasters. So just to reiterate that in UN Women, this is precisely how we look at it, the holistic way of looking at it. And yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Verona, and sorry for keeping you a little bit longer. You can jump off as soon as you need to, of course. Lisa, do you want to add anything as a closing? If you're still there? You're self-muted, so you'll need to unmute yourself if you'd like.
Okay, I just did that. Yeah, I think there wasn't a question in specific regarding the guidance note for the submissions, but yeah, I just want to quickly go back to that, what Titi said, her contribution and her comment, like the importance of the experiences and activities on the local level with local communities. And yeah, I just want to repeat myself by encouraging you to add all that to those submissions that are now open until the end of March. Like add, your work, your experiences with local communities, with Indigenous peoples, with women's groups to that submission. And at least that's what GenderCC, what we're planning to do, like to really highlight in the submissions all the work that we've done in the past years, the methodologies we've developed, the research projects that we've conducted, and the findings that we had. Again, I'm repeating myself, I really think it's a window of opportunity to use this time also to raise the good work that we as women and gender organizations have been doing on this issue in the past, and to make this available to parties for them to use and for them to help them to integrate gender issues better in their national climate activities.
Excellent. I think that is a really important message, and one that we can leave off with on this first update. And certainly there's a couple of other pieces raised that are important related to an M&E framework. How, I think we mentioned before, the Women and Gender constituency are already really thinking hard about how we do this sort of analysis and monitoring beyond just calling for information, how we start to look at and assess where gaps still are. And I think that doing so in collaboration and getting feedback from other processes that we've tracked before, and certainly doing it in relationship with the tracking and monitoring that's happening around the SDGs is all really important. And luckily, we are all very connected to these different processes. There is some coherence that exists already in that space. And one of the things that we'll continue to do is to try to provide opportunities like this, both at the upcoming session and in future, to share across different agencies, communities, hopefully grassroots organizations and Indigenous groups in the next type of update we can do on how they are thinking about and utilizing a gender action plan. I'll just reiterate again that because I think after the COP, I have a lot of questions and conversations with people asking how the Gender Action Plan now changes things, how it helps women on the ground, how it's going to create gender equality. And, you know, it is very much an action plan on paper that needs the action put into it. It's all about the level of commitment that we have to utilizing this, not just in terms of the individual activities that our organizations and constituencies will undertake, but in how we really work and strive to build this in a collective and strategic way, to use this to help amplify and to action not just at a global level, but really at a national, sub-regional, and local level. By having this kind of framework we can all feed into and that we can monitor the progress on. And I just wanted to, in closing, I don't know, Laura unfortunately isn't on here anymore, but I did want to update that there will be another webinar happening next month that is with another group of organizations from civil society starting to think out loud and report on how they will be looking at and implementing the Gender Action Plan. So I will send the information around about that in the next when we share the outputs from this. All of the PowerPoints that you saw are actually uploaded here as part of the handouts, and we will share them again when I share the recording of this session. Thank you to everyone for joining, and I hope to see some of you at the upcoming end of April, May session of the UNFCCC in Bonn, and the rest of you on the internet somewhere or in person in the near future. Thank you for joining, and have a great day.